Hi, I'm Phil Harbell and this is my 81st video about British science fiction. This time I want to discuss the lost short stories of Philip E. High and to give an update on my Cosmos Literary Agency activities. High was born in Bedfordshire in 1914 and his family moved to Kent when he was 7. Apart from war service in the Royal Navy, he lived in Kent for the rest of his life. He married Pamela Baker in 1950 and they're survived by 2 daughters, Beverly and Jacqueline, who can be justly proud of their father's writing career. Before the war, High had avidly read such British SF magazines as he could find, such as the Juvenile Boys Weekly Scoops and the imported American SF pulp magazines. During the war, he still contrived to obtain copies of the pulp magazines, and post-war, he read all the emerging new British science fiction magazines, including New Worlds, edited by John Cornell, and Fantasy, edited by Walter Gillings, as well as the British reprint editions of Astounding Science Fiction. But as I pointed out in my earlier videos, it wasn't until 1950 that science fiction really began to take a hold in Britain, spearheaded by the novels of John Russell Fearn, writing as Vargo Staton for Sky Unlimited. Within a year, rival publishers such as Hamilton and Company, Panther Books, and Curtis Warren joined Sky in publishing a branded line of science fiction novels. High told me he was a regular reader of these novels, but it was not until the science fiction boom also began to embrace British SF magazines that he suddenly realised the literary opportunities that were opening up and began to write science fiction himself. His first serious attempt, The Statics, appeared in the September 1955 issue of Authentic Science Fiction, edited by H.J. Campbell. Let's have a look. The contents page there. And the story, The Statics. It is his very first short story in Authentic. The Statics described a future-controlled society and was told from the viewpoint of a police department investigating an apparent murder, something completely unprecedented in their static society, where serious crime had supposedly been eliminated. The story stood out and marked High as a writer with a facility for unusual and original plotting. Now, High began to submit a steady stream of news stories to the other leading British science fiction magazines, in addition to Authentic. His stories followed the conventions of the day: interstellar exploration, interplanetary colonies, alien invasions, and the like. However, these elements were observed from a totally fresh angle. His own wide background reading, and in particular his knowledge of psychology, gave his stories a depth of intelligence and thought that transcended their apparently linear plotting. His second story, Wrath of the Gods, sold to Nebula Science Fiction, edited by Peter Hamilton, and eventually appeared in July 1956. It was quickly followed by other stories to Nebula. Let's have a look at the contents page here. See story there, Time Bomb. It was an excellent story. There it is. Illustrated by fan artist Arthur Thompson. Now enthused, High incorporated John Cornell's New Worlds into his orbit, as well as repeating his success at Authentic and Nebula. After the demise of both Authentic and Nebula, John Cornell virtually had the British field to himself. By sheer dedication, he succeeded in establishing another 2 sister magazines to New Worlds: Science Fantasy and Science Fiction Adventures, all published by Nova Publications. By the 1960s, High was appearing almost exclusively in the Nova magazines, and particularly notable stories included Routine Exercise, 1961, and Dead End, 1962. Let's see, story Dead End, and there's the story itself. But after Nova stopped publishing magazines, High virtually ceased writing short fiction. Instead, encouraged by John Cornell, who'd offered to agent his work, he decided to concentrate on novels, dark, sometimes dystopian visions, in a framework of bizarre adventure. Cornell had sold High's first novel, The Prodigal Son, to Ace Books in 1963, and whilst continuing to work full-time, High averaged a book a year throughout the 1960s and early 70s. We see some of those paperback and hardcover novels here. Published by Ace Books, Paperback Library, and Dobson for his UK hardcovers. In 1969, I found myself appointed as editor of a new British magazine, Vision of Tomorrow. Since the demise of Cornell's magazines, nearly all of the professional writers in the UK had pretty much stopped writing science fiction short stories, now concentrating on novels aimed at the American market. John Cornell, in his capacity as a literary agent, became an invaluable ally. Through him, I was able to appeal to a number of formerly prolific authors to return to the short story medium. They included the likes of Ken Bulmer and William F. Temple. Another who rallied to my aid was Philip E. High, with 4 new short stories. The best of this group was Psycholand. See the title at the bottom of there. And this judgment was confirmed by the readers, who voted it the best story in the issue. There we see it. Incidentally, that's illustrated by Dickie Howard, who's nowadays quite famous as an illustrator of the humour strips for the Daleks. After Vision of Tomorrow ceased publication in 1970, see my video number 63 for the full story, once again High stopped writing short stories and concentrated on his novels. But following the death of his first agent, John Cornell, whom High came to regard as a personal friend, and later his main publisher in the US, Don Wollheim, High became discouraged and slipped into literary retirement, coinciding with his own retirement as a bus driver in 1979. For more than a quarter of a century, no new High stories appeared, a criminal waste of his undoubted talent. Anthology recognition was sparse, despite High's having been included as one of the leading British SF writers in Mike Ashley's The Best of British SF, Volume 2, in 1977. You see here that Mike Ashley had judged that High could keep company with those other eminent British authors, which you see there. And High selected this story, The Jackson Killer, as his best work. The stories in the anthology were chosen by the authors as representing their best work. In 1985, Roger Payton, editing the Venture SF line for Hamlin, see one of their paperbacks here, reprinted 2 of High's later novels, intended using more, but the line was cancelled. And during all that time, many new science fiction magazines came and went in the UK, but none of their editors had the good sense to invite High to write for them. Phil told me, most of the gaps in my writing life were due to misinformation. For instance, immediately following my retirement in 1979, and throughout the whole of the following decade, I was assured by many who should have known better that the popularity of SF was well and truly finished. Magazines, I was told, were folding left, right and centre. I was given no encouragement to continue with my writing. All the gaps in my writing years may be referred to the same cause, the belief that there was no publishing market. Now, John Russell Fearn became my first client in 1970 when I was asked to act for his widow, Carrie Fearn. Around the same time, I also began acting unofficially on an occasional basis for Sidney J. Bounds and E.C. Tubb, especially with foreign translations and anthology appearances. But it was not until after I'd taken early retirement in the late 1990s and became a full-time literary agent that I became their official representative and also began to expand my clientele. Now, many of my new clients were veteran British authors, such as Brian Ball, who had formerly been with the E.J. Cornell Agency. But following the death of Cornell and the retirement of his successor, Les Flood, they were also drifting towards retirement, until I offered to find new outlets for them, as well as restoring their backlists to print. In 1997, annoyed with what we perceived as a discriminatory and restricted British SF short story market, my American correspondent Sean Wallace and myself decided to publish our own magazine, Fantasy Annual, for which I revived my old imprint Cosmos Books. I contacted a number of former Vision authors for material, including the recently widowed Phil High, who was eager to try writing short stories again and had no hesitation in buying the first story he sent me, The Kiss. See the contents page there. This is the second issue of the magazine. E.C. Tubb, Sid Bounds and others. And this was Phil High's first new story in over 10 years, The Kiss. Okay. Thereafter, I was favoured with a steady flow of new stories, wherein High's old skills and inventiveness were still on display. Phil asked me to become his literary agent. In 1999, I agreed to license the Cosmos Books imprint to John Betancourt Wildside Press in the United States, and he also then hired Sean Wallace as his editorial assistant. But this was on the understanding that Wildside would continue to publish Fantasy Annual, along with the books and authors we'd had in mind for our own imprint. At my suggestion, Phil adopted his first ever pseudonym, B.J. Empson, so that I could feature more than one of his stories in a particular issue, where expedient. The name was derived from the initials of Phil's two daughters, Beverly and Jacqueline, and his middle name, E for Empson. Wildside also optioned most of High's novels for reprinting, which pleased him immensely. And there we see some of the succeeding issues of Fantasy Adventures. See B.J. Empson and Phil High in the contents. Also got stories from several veteran British writers. and a couple of newcomers as well, as you can see from the contents page. But such was the number and quality of High's short story submissions, together with those of his contemporaries, such as Sid Bounds and Ted Tubb, that I decided to launch a new magazine, Fantasy Quarterly, where they could be featured, which Wildside promised to publish on a quarterly basis. And there we see Fantasy Quarterly. Contents page, and that's it. Now thereafter that, Wildside promised that they would keep it going, 4 issues a year, Fantasy Quarterly, and then Wildside quickly reprinted 4 Phil High novels in paperback, beginning with Speaking of Dinosaurs. 3 of the 4 titles repurposed Ron Turner covers, which we see here. Speaking of Dinosaurs was the first one. Then there came Invader on My Back, These Savage Futurians, and Butterfly Planet, along with other books by Bounds and Tubb and the late John Russell Fearn, whose copyrights I had inherited. I also edited for Wildside a number of best-of anthologies, including the Best of Philip E. High, which we see here. There was a dozen or so of where I judged, and Phil agreed with me, as being his best short stories. This book was quite successful and was quite well reviewed. Now, during this period, I enjoyed meeting Phil High at the regular London book fairs, when I would also meet up with my other clients, such as Brian Ball, Ted Tubb, Sid Bounds and Ernest Dudley, the BBC's armchair detective, and creator of the famous Dr. Morell radio series and detective books. There's Phil High signing his books, Ernest Dudley, myself, and Brian Ball, and Sid Bounds. And here we're able to sign copies for the fans and to promote the sales of our Wildside titles through my friend bookseller Bob Wardzinski, nowadays known to YouTubers as Dorset Bob. This was the first time in many years that Phil had the opportunity to meet his public and his fellow authors, and he was immensely pleased and gratified to discover that he was still remembered. Fans discovered that he was very approachable and happy to sign his books. Now, these were heady and happy times for Phil, but unfortunately they were not the last. Wildside's sudden success and expansion with their limited staff resources led to their being unable to issue quickly many of the remaining titles I'd contracted to them. Nor did the titles they published receive much promotion. And because of continuing publishing delays, Fantasy Quarterly was cancelled, and I relaunched it as Fantasy Adventures. It's Fantasy Adventures to disguise the fact that it was now appearing irregularly. Created in 2002 to commission new stories by neglected older British SF writers such as Brian Ball, Sid Bounds, John Glasby, Tony Glynn, Philip E. High, E.C. Tubb, and also to feature new writers such as Eric Brown. Each issue of Fantasy Adventures also contained a reprint of one of John Russell Fearn's best 1950s novels, and would feature 10 posthumous covers by Ron Turner. And we see there 3 new covers by the legendary Sidney Jordan, whom I'd met at a London book fair, along with my clients Sid Bounds and Ted Tubb. Sidney Jordan had agreed to paint covers around their new stories, and we see the covers here. Just have a look at a few of the contents pages of these magazines. But as the magazines became increasingly irregular, I quickly built up a large inventory of unpublished Phil High short stories. And from these I selected an all-new 10-story collection, Step to the Stars, which, following my strong representation, was published by Wildside in 2004. Wildside Press continued to expand exponentially, but my science fiction authors remained peripheral to their operation. So at my suggestion, many of them that were still active had turned increasingly to writing westerns and detective mystery stories for other publishers here in England, with great success. Former Wildside Cosmos SF authors, Ball and Bounds, Glasby, Tony Glynn and E.C. Tubb would soon have more than 100 new and reprinted westerns and detective mystery novels returned to print in the UK at a rate of 5 novels a month. Unfortunately, Phil High had not written in these other fields, and so he continued to write SF and fantasy short stories, even though he knew I couldn't quickly publish them. In 2006, having been diagnosed with cancer, Phil, a widower, decided to sell his house and move to Stony Stratford in Buckinghamshire in order to be closer to his daughter Beverly in nearby Newport Pagnell. He decided to fight the cancer with radiotherapy and was determined to continue writing as long as he was able. He even began writing his own first Western novel and completed the first chapter, which was excellent. But tragically, with his house sale agreed and a new home secured, Phil suffered a heart attack and was admitted to hospital just a few days before he was due to move. Recovering from the heart attack, Phil eventually succumbed to respiratory failure and chest infection, and he died on August the 9th, 2006. I still miss Phil High tremendously. He was a modest and kindly man, softly spoken, courteous, helpful, always full of enthusiasm, a gentleman and a fine writer. Then in 2008, following the sad deaths of first High and then Sid Bounds, I'd been left with a number of their unpublished short stories. Sid, too, after his cancer diagnosis, had bravely continued to write for me right up to the end. An amazing professional, Sid had even managed to complete a contracted Last Savage Western novel for Robert Hale, only 2 weeks before he died. And Savage Rage West was a wonderful last novel. I complained bitterly to Wildside Sean Wallace about their reneging on my magazine's quarterly schedule, which had caused Phil and Sid's short stories not to be published, and which their authors would now never see in print. Sean offered to quickly publish a bumper double-size issue. Whilst grateful for this opportunity, I was so stressed and fed up that I decided to end Fantasy Adventures altogether with number 13, making it a double-size issue featuring the obituaries of both High and Bounds, and no less than 11 of the unpublished stories, along with those of my other contributors, including John Glasby and Eric Brown, who had 3 stories each. See from the contents page there. Lots of stories by Bounds and High, and then 3 stories each by the authors I mentioned, and the obituaries of the authors, and then I concluded that with a Fern novel. High still remaining unpublished SF and fantasy manuscripts went into storage as I turned increasingly to Western and detective novels, and unfortunately the manuscripts were mislaid. In recent years I've managed to get High's SF novel Double Illusion, aka Mad Metropolis, reprinted in the UK, followed by a couple of new High collections with reprinted short stories, Guilty as Charged, and the Loom ebook Lords of Creation, whereas these other novels are still available as ebooks in Orion's SF Gateway series. Now, I also recently sold these classic short stories, Routine Exercise and The Jackson Killer, to a Hungarian magazine, Galactica. Here we see their translations. Galactica is a splendid magazine, as you see, full colour illustrations. I also sold some stories by my other client, Sydney Bounds. There's a Sid Bounds story, published in Hungarian. That's good. But then in December 2025, I finally found a lost short story manuscript which had been hidden in a kitchen drawer. Now, shortly before their rediscovery, thanks to Stephen Jones, I'd been contacted by Phantasmagoria editor Trevor Kennedy in his capacity as agent. And in my capacity as agent for Ron Turner, I agreed that he could feature some Turner illustrations in his special issue on the Daleks, which we see here, Daleks special issue. Find it. Oh, there we are. There's Trevor's feature on the comic Dalek. Incidentally, this page here is by Eric Eden, not by Ron Turner. There's the Ron Turner double page spread, and there's his classic TV 21 version of the Daleks, which we've seen before. A superb issue covering the films and the TV series and the books and everything you want to know about the Daleks. Great stuff. Now, when I advised Trevor of the existence of new unpublished High stories, he asked to see some, and I sent them a batch. I'm delighted to report that 2 of the best of these lost manuscripts will now be seen in Phantasmagoria, beginning with the last specimen in the March 2026 issue, number 28, which has just been published. We see it here. It's available to buy from the magazine's website or from Amazon. Let's have a look. Well, that's one of the articles. That's not the Sid Bounds one. The Phil High one. Bear with me. There we are. There's an article on Phil High which I did. This video is partially based on this article. Seen some of these. And there's the first ever publication of the Lost Manuscript by Phil High. Now, as you can see, there's a lot more to this magazine than just those articles. My article, it's packed with book reviews. You've got lots of new fiction as well. And, some terrific articles featuring in-depth interviews with Joe Hill, the son of Stephen King, and Peter Straub, which was so. Now, I was so impressed with that magazine, Phantasmagoria, that I asked my client, Edmund Glasby, the son of the legendary writer John Glasby, and now following in his father's footsteps as a talented author of the supernatural, to write a new short story especially for it. I'm pleased to report that Ed's latest story, The Disturbed, has been accepted by Trevor Kennedy and set to appear later this year, to be followed by Edmund's article about his father's Lovecraft mythos stories, one of which will be reprinted for the very first time. Meanwhile, the remaining other Lost New High stories are slated to appear in Wildside's noted Black Cat ebook magazine in the US, which has already been reprinting many of High's old SF magazine stories. I hope Phil High's fans will forgive me for their long interment. Now then. Speaking of long interments, I have some exciting news of the returning to print after some 60 years of some classic film adaptations by my client John Burke. And following approval by Hammer Films, agreement has been struck for Titan Books to republish the Hammer Horror Film Omnibus, volumes 1 and 2. Each volume contains 4 novels by Burke based on the famous Hammer horror films, including The Gorgon, The Curse of Frankenstein, The Revenge of Frankenstein, The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, The Reptile, Dracula, Prince of Darkness, Rasputin the Mad Monk, and The Plague of the Zombies. The original Old Pan edition, you'll see there, one of them, are now very expensive collector's items, almost impossible to find. But in autumn this year, Titan Books will be making their superb new editions available worldwide, and I'll bring you more news nearer the time. And finally, I'm pleased to confirm that Rich Harvey's Bold Venture Press in the US have agreed to publish my latest book on the life and work of John Russell Fearn. This new book is a composite work that draws upon the scores of articles, introductions and previous books on fern written by me across the last 60 years, and they've been selectively revised and updated with much new material for this new edition, in particular The Multi-Man and Vultures of the Void, The Legacy. John Russell Fern, The Multi-Man, will contain my 100,000 words official biography, my official biography of Fern, see the detail there. The new book will contain my 100,000 word official biography and a separate fully annotated worldwide bibliography detailing every story and novel Fern wrote, with every reprinting and translation into 12 languages. It will be lavishly illustrated and is the culmination of over 60 years of intensive research. Rich Harvey and myself are still working on the design of the book, and I'll bring you more news as the book takes shape.